Welcome back to the Modern Maze. Hope that everybody's doing well and that you're having a beautiful day so far. I'm really excited about today's episode. We're going to be speaking to Alison Whitten, who is the Director of Systems Lab at Regen Melbourne, about the Melbourne Doughnut. So, taken from Doughnut Economics, Regen Melbourne has created a version of the Doughnut framework for the Greater Melbourne area. Before today's episode, I thought it may be worth just recapping Doughnut Economics a little bit. Again, if you want to learn everything Doughnut Economics, the second episode that we released is covering the entire book. I'd also recommend, if you can't be bothered listening to the whole episode, just jumping on YouTube or just Googling it. There's, in particular, I'll link this in the show notes, a TED talk from Kate Raworth, who's the creator of Doughnut Economics, where it's a 15-minute video where she talks about Doughnut Economics in a really concise way. Good to get some context before today's interview with Alison. But I thought it would be worthwhile just to recap what we have gone through previously. So what is the problem that Doughnut Economics is trying to solve? What is the framework designed for? In today's time, we have economies that have to grow and are designed around this need to grow, regardless of how much we're thriving as a result. The concept of always growing is something that is really built into our psychology because we see growth as a sign of progress. We see more as a sign of progress. It's one of the most beautiful things about humans is that we're always striving for more and striving for greater. But when it comes to economic growth, what does this growth actually mean? How does it serve us and our planet? Since the mid-20th century, economic progress has increased 10 times. So this is since the 1950s. And it's lifted millions out of poverty. It's led to healthier, more educated lives, giving people the resources and financial stability that they need. And this era has also marked a great increase in things such as gender equality and political participation. But this growth and returns has been increasingly being shared to a smaller and smaller group of people, the global 1%. In addition, this era of unprecedented economic growth is known as the Great Acceleration and has led to never seen before use of the Earth's resources. From 1950 to 2010, as populations tripled and GDP skyrocketed, the strain on water, energy, and natural habitats has surged, pushing our planet towards its ecological limits and rapidly destabilizing our planet. So since the 1950s, we have had incredible GDP growth, incredible economic growth. But what has that meant for the world today? How does the world look today? Does it reflect the fact that we've been so successful in economic growth? What's the fruits of that labor? What is there to show for it? And so is GDP, is measuring only the total cost of the goods and services that an economy produces the best way to actually show how we are progressing as a society? And what the book discusses and what Kate talks about and what Doughnut Economics is really built on is the fact that what your goal is a really important first step in actually determining what you choose to spend your resources on. So if everyone from the government to corporations to CEOs to managers, if everybody is glued to the task of growing more, increasing GDP, increasing production and consumption, what does that actually mean for how we're progressing? What do we choose to invest in? What do we not choose to invest in? How does GDP and always growing tie our hands from actually doing the things that we need to do? Because even if you look at sustainability, and we talk about this in our first episode, but even things like renewables, even all of the green investing, at the end of the day, right now, it is still tied to growth and money. And that is still an outcome, probably a major outcome of what we choose to invest in still. The reason why renewables is increasing so much is, yeah, it's doing a lot of good for the planet and people see it, but people would not be investing in it unless it brought some sort of financial return. That's just not the way that the world is structured right now. And so Doughnut Economics proposes a framework that allows us to more holistically capture the social and environmental factors that we should be striving towards. I'm going to share my screen just for a little representation. This is just a reminder. If you can watch this video, please do. There will be a link to the YouTube video, because when Alison and I go through the Melbourne Doughnut, she will be taking us through the donut and all of the layers within. So would highly recommend checking this out on video. But if not, I'm just going to describe the donut visually for us to just get a sense of it. Okay, so this is just on Kate's website, and this is a picture of the donut. So the donut is comprised of two rings. The inner ring is the social aspects. So what are the needs of people in order to live a dignified life? What are all of the essentials that people need? So you'll see here in these social foundations that there are things such as energy, so access to electricity. You have food, education, so percentage of children and adults that have access to education, political voice, housing, etc., etc. So the inner ring is the social foundation. If there is a shortfall, so for example, here we can see that political voice is pushing up towards the center of the circle, that means that there is a shortfall in this social foundation. So the way that it's measured, the closer towards the middle means the higher the shortfall. And we will see this when we look at the Melbourne Doughnut as well. So in this example here, we can see that education appears to have less of a shortfall than political voice in this example here. So that's the social foundation. We want to try and make sure that people have enough of the things that they need to meet their needs, meet their social, health, food needs. Then the second circle, which is the outermost circle, are our planetary boundaries. So these planetary boundaries describe our major Earth systems, so our life systems. So we talk about climate change, ozone layer depletion, air pollution, biodiversity loss, etc., etc. These are the major systems that make up our planet and how it functions environmentally. These boundaries were found, or not found, they've always been there, but discovered first, this framework in 2009, when some scientists set out to try and understand what are the tipping points in our Earth systems. So what are the moments or the points upon which there is no turning back? Because there will be a point. think sometimes we think that the earth can heal itself, which it absolutely can. The earth is incredibly powerful and Mother Nature is so wise and, can do anything. But there is a point at which we tip it out of balance. And we can see some of that happening now with climate change, biodiversity loss. We're talking about species that are going extinct. So there's never a chance of them coming back naturally. So what are these tipping points in our Earth systems? And that's what we're trying to measure in the outside layer. And so with this layer, the further out that a shading goes, that means that we are pushing more on that system, that we're reaching that tipping point for that particular area. Now, between these two circles, your social foundation and your ecological ceiling, is a Goldilocks zone. This is the point where humanity can live in an environmentally safe and socially just space. And this is where we can thrive. The beauty of Doughnut Economics is that it really highlights the fact that we're not just talking about the environment here, and we're not just talking about social issues. They are inherently linked. And in order to really make the change and build the world that we need to build, we need to think about both of these things, because it can be really easy without a view of the whole picture. And that's what the Doughnut tries to give us, is a whole picture of the social and environmental aspects, is that you may pick an issue in detriment of other issues, whether environmentally or socially. So an example could be that we talk about this in the episode. I really like this example from Alison, but we think about housing. So there is a housing shortfall. We're seeing that in Australia. We're seeing that in a few places around the world, but probably more than a few. So we obviously want to address housing because that's such a huge, it's a huge thing for somebody to live a dignified and safe life, is housing. But how are you going about that housing? Are you just building housing wherever you can? Are you thinking about, for example, the biodiversity loss? Are you thinking about the land conversion? What areas are you converting into this? It could be climate change as well. How are these houses being built? What are the materials, et cetera, et cetera? And so if you were to just look at housing, of course we need to solve that and we need solutions against that. But what are all the other factors that come into play? The other thing as well is, okay, so we look at a social foundation and we need to look at the environmental. The other thing is that each circle, the factors are linked within the circle itself. So what I mean in this example is, for housing, as an example, what are the other social things that we need to think about when building them? An example, it's called networks here. The Melbourne one has one called mobility, which is all about public transport. And so, okay, we're building houses. Where are we building them? Are we building them in the middle of nowhere where someone may not have reasonable access to go into the city to work? Are we building housing in a cost-efficient manner so that people can afford, things like food and energy? They can pay all their bills. They can afford education. They have work opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the thing that I absolutely love about this framework, is it just allows us to get a really big holistic view of all of the issues going on right now and how they interplay with each other. So with that little preamble done, let's jump into our conversation with Alison. Enjoy. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Modern Maze. Today, I have the privilege and honor of being joined by Alison Whitten, the Director of Systems Lab at Regen Melbourne. In our second episode, we talked all about Doughnut Economics, which was the book that sort of set me on this journey. And one of sort of the biggest moments I had last year and in this journey already was going to Regen Melbourne's events where they unveiled the Melbourne Doughnut. So Melbourne has a donut. It's beautiful to look at. We're going to talk all about it. But first, to you, Alison, if you could introduce yourself and Regen Melbourne and all the amazing work that you guys are doing there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me today. It's great to have the chance to talk about the Melbourne Doughnut, which I love doing. My background is a bit of a mix, which I think is really suitable for the kind of work that we're doing right now. I started out as a systems engineer and made my way through some time in management consulting and international development and ended up going back to school to study urban planning. And I feel like what I'm doing now at Regen Melbourne is a really nice confluence of a lot of these elements of my education and professional experience, really looking at the city as a system and how we unpack the different layers of that system to try and make a place that's more equitable and safe ecologically for people and all that comes with Greater Melbourne. So that's a little bit of my background. And I joined Regen Melbourne coming up on 2 years ago, but I've been involved in the journey behind Regen Melbourne since the beginning. So Regen Melbourne is a platform for collaboration in service to the city. And when we talk about the city, we're talking about Greater Melbourne, not just the central city or the municipality of the city of Melbourne, but all of Greater Melbourne. And at the time that Regen Melbourne sort of formed as an idea, it was off the back of the Black Summer bushfires, and we were all sitting in lockdown in our respective homes across the city and beyond, sort of wondering what the future would hold, kind of feeling these multiple crises in a really heavy way. And this was a good chance for us to be able to explore a new vision for Greater Melbourne and to really think about what's needed to bring Melbourne into that future. So I can dive into a lot of detail about that and how that relates to the Melbourne Doughnut, but that starts to give you a sense of the questions that we were starting to explore that led to the formation of Regen Melbourne.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. So you said, when we had our bushfires here, that was sort of the moment that Regen Melbourne came together. How did you meet the other folk at Regen Melbourne, or sort of how did that come together then from that moment?
Sure. So a lot of this actually started through a series of conversations that were being held with this question in mind around what is the future we want to see for our city. And this included some discussions about Doughnut Economics with Kate Rayworth herself, beaming in, of course, not here in person, but starting to say, how could the Doughnut be a tool that we could use or a framework that we could use to examine that question of what we want our vision to be for the city? And so this was being convened by Small Giants Academy, which is a space that's looking at what that future economy needs to be and how new forms of leadership and new forms of convening can be organized to support that kind of change. So Small Giants was really leading a lot of these discussions from a visioning and strategic standpoint and started to come together with the likes of the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, who provided some seed funding for some work. The City of Melbourne, which is where I was at the time. I was working in urban resilience at the time, so very related to what we're talking about today, but from within local government, as well as partners at Circular Economy Victoria and the Coalition of Everyone. So really thinking about this from a variety of vantage points. And we started getting together saying, okay, how do we start to launch something that looks, bigger than ourselves and bigger than these individual ideas that we might have that can explore this question? And so as a group, these 5 organizations, along with support from a number of individuals who are interested in these questions and really excited by Doughnut Economics, convened a series of community workshops. We called it a community-led research project because it really was unpacking this new question in a really interesting and open and generative way. And so, again, with the support of Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation kind of funding that first phase, we were able to go out and host these workshops, again, sort of being this pulse point in the midst of lockdowns and this chance to convene virtually and say, what does it look like for the city to be moving towards the Doughnut, moving towards that safe and just space where we're meeting our basic social needs and doing so while respecting the boundaries of the planet. And it was super exciting, actually. I found it really comforting to have this point on Monday mornings, 10 to 12, it sort of became this ritual to come together, have these fun conversations. We ended up having over 500 individuals and 50 organizations involved in the process, really feeding into what this vision might look like. And this is what allowed us to create the Melbourne Doughnut as the sort of first artifact. So I've got holding up the visual of this, which was really beautifully hand-drawn and allowed us to sort of personalize the donut for what we wanted it to look like in Melbourne. And so this we launched, and I can get into some of the details of what we changed on this from the original donut. But we launched this at Melbourne Knowledge Week in early 2021. It was sort of this funny gap in lockdowns that we had where we were allowed out and there were over 200 people, I think, in the room. And Kate Rayworth was being beamed in as the keynote speaker for Melbourne Knowledge Week. And it gave us a chance to launch the Melbourne Doughnut and say, look at what's been generated here behind this framework, and let's look at the energy that we have here. Associated with that, we had a vision that we developed just on the other side of my little prop. But it really speaks to the way that we saw a regenerative Melbourne as being a place that's knowledgeable, full of life, affordable, connected through culture, collaborative, and enabled. And so it was this really interesting way that we could look holistically at the vision we wanted for the city and how the donut could help us describe that when we break down what that means socially and ecologically. And so the question really became, what do we do from here? We've got this energy, we've got the vision, we've got the donut, and how do we bring this all to life? And that's really where Regen Melbourne as an entity formed. There was energy around where we wanted to go with these ideas. And so Kai Lofgren, who is now our CEO and was working basically out of Small Giant and leading this from that vantage point, was able to secure some seed funding for a couple of years of experimentation. And so there was some really great energy poured into what it would look like to generate grassroots types of activities and really test a bottom-up approach to that regeneration of the city. We have evolved our thinking a bit since then in looking at how we can have the most potent interventions come from organizing organizations around this goal and really thinking about how we can bring together a lot of energy towards specific projects that we think embody this idea of regeneration and can serve as pathways towards the safe and just space that the Melbourne Doughnut describes. So that's really where we're most focused right now is what are these projects? We call them wildly ambitious projects, such as making the Yarra River the Birrarung swimmable, how we can use these projects as pathways to demonstrate what we mean by regeneration in the city and move us again towards that donut.
Great. Thank you for the rundown. It's really, because I've had some exposure to the Melbourne Doughnut, but even in how you're explaining the steps, it's really beautiful how you've taken the energy of that and really brought it to life, something tangible. And now it's sort of what's next? How do we action organizations to use this? And how do we move towards a regenerative Melbourne? I guess, just curious, do you have a personal story with Doughnut Economics? As in, when was the first time you heard of it? Or, how did it sort of pop up into your life?
Great question. It was actually around the time that these conversations were starting that I first learned about the donut. And I think what really appealed to me was the way that this aligned with the thinking that I had had running throughout my whole career. When I started studying engineering, it was with this idea that I could be looking at how technology informs society in ways that can be productive socially and ecologically. And I went back to the kind of frameworks that were available to me at the time. And a lot of the thinking at that time was around triple bottom line. How do we see social, environmental, and economic outcomes kind of all in balance with each other? And at the time that felt quite innovative and it felt very progressive and forward thinking. But what's interesting is that the donut, I think, takes that a step further that makes even greater sense to me and my orientation towards social justice and concern about the challenges we're facing, for example, climate change, obviously, and all of these various factors that are coming together now. I think the donut really tests our ability to move past that triple bottom line framing, looking at all of these things equally, and starts to move us to a place where we can say, well, how is the economy actually in service to people and planet? And how do we sort of reframe what's most important in that sense and what we're serving, what we're here to serve? So I think it's been a really interesting way to bring together that confluence of different experiences I've had and the sort of beginning of my own professional journey towards this place.
Amazing. Well, I think that's a really good overview of Regen Melbourne and the Doughnut. I think if there's anything else, would you like to get into it and show people the Doughnut and what we're talking about and the beautiful designs and all of the numbers sitting behind it?
Can do. Absolutely. So let me pull up the city portrait, which has a story in and of itself, moving from the beautiful hand-drawn donut that we started with in 2021. And I'll speak to a couple of the dimensions I mentioned that we added to this donut, and then talk about the experience that we had going from a conceptual lens of the donut through to the data-based city portrait that we have here. So going back to that original donut and the way that we modified this for Melbourne, we were really interested in saying, how does this land in our city? What are the things that are most important to us? And there are a couple of things I always like to point out. One was this idea of adding in arts and culture as a dimension to the donut, because this is something that was not represented in the global donut, but we think is really central to Melbourne's identity in the way that we attract people to the city, what's appealing about living in Melbourne, what we export globally. So it's very much tied to our identity as Melburnians. The other aspect that we added that I think is quite significant is this element around healing and reconnecting to country and each other. And there are a couple different ways that I remember this coming about. One of these was really thinking about how we show the dynamic nature between the social foundation of the donut and the ecological ceiling, and the fact that, while the donut seeks to provide a really holistic framework, it still breaks things down into dimensions and sectors and so on. And it also separates spatially the social and the ecological. But we know that these are always in relationship with each other, and they're always changing as well. So the era we have here and this element, to some extent, are designed to really show a more dynamic, ever-changing kind of relational aspect between the social and the ecological. The other aspect of this that we were aiming to reflect here was around the deep knowledge that exists among traditional owners and the Indigenous members of our community who have lived in this place much longer than most of us or our families have. And there's a real need for us, if we're thinking about regeneration of a place, to acknowledge and fully understand the richness of that knowledge and the deep connectedness to place. And so the healing and reconnecting to country and each other is also an acknowledgement of that, and the way that, again, from an Indigenous worldview, we are part of country, we are tied to country really inherently, and we can't separate these things. So the relational aspect that gets folded into that understanding of place is really critical for us as we think about not only the way that we describe a framework, but how we approach all of our work and basically everything that we do. So those are two elements that I think are really useful to outline in relation to the Melbourne Doughnut.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I absolutely love the healing and reconnecting to country and each other edition. I think it's just so important to call out that the disconnection from nature and the earth upon which we stand has led to, just us not maybe taking some topics in mind or thinking about things as thoroughly as we need to be. And I really do believe that reconnecting to the land is such a big part of what we have to try and, get to, and reconnect people in the cities to nature, and just try and get everybody really back to that. And as well as just acknowledging the Indigenous knowledge that has been here for thousands and thousands of years, and being cognizant of that and being respectful of that, and understanding that there is so much wisdom there for us to use that will really help us still. So yeah, I absolutely love that bit. It's just, one of my favorite things about the Melbourne Doughnut. So thank you for taking us through that.
Absolutely. Now I can walk through how we set up this city portrait as a platform overall. And we knew that we would be creating something that people with varying levels of knowledge and familiarity with the donut would be exploring. And so we wanted to make this accessible to everyone to learn about the donut. So we started out with this question of what is this donut thingy? And really wanted to unpack what the donut framework is, which I know that you've already explored previously, but we'll walk through this quickly. Just acknowledging again that the inside of the donut, the social foundation, is made up of the elements that we need to live good lives. And so these include, again, health, housing, peace and justice, social, sort of physical things as well. And we know that falling short of this social foundation can lead to harm and disadvantage. So in the visual that we've created here, the more red, the worse off we're doing, basically. And we'll get into some of how we applied data to this here. At the same time, we have limits to the planet's capacity to provide for us safely and to care for our ecosystems. So that's the ecological ceiling as we've defined it here. And overshooting obviously can lead to ecological disaster, which we feel in different ways depending on where we are in the city and outside of the city as well. And so the donut is really the sweet spot that we're aiming for, of course. And now I think what's interesting in Melbourne, when we start to look at the narrative here, is that we talk a lot about livability in our city. And that's a lot of the reason why people move here. It's touted as one of the most livable cities in the world. But what we started to uncover as we applied data to the donut was that livability hasn't been equally available to everyone. And so that's where we see that red occurring, according to the data that we've identified. And also, I think even more so, we see the livability that we do have putting extreme pressure on the planet, especially when we look at carbon emissions, for example, as well as land conversion, basically the amount of land that's required here and elsewhere to support our lifestyles. And so this is pretty significant for us to grapple with. And so we talk about living in urgent and complex times where none of these are easy challenges to be solving, but this is a way that we can start to understand the relationship between various things and some of the ways that we can respond in systemic approaches as well. And so to get into the data, really this was the question of, okay, let's see, how do we take that conceptual donut that we have and start to put data to it so it can be really practically useful and, again, start to guide us towards how we're actually doing socially and ecologically. And so what we did in late 2022 through to the first half of 2023, we started with the social foundation and we ran a workshop on each of the dimensions here to ask the question, well, what would it look like to live in a regenerative Melbourne in relation to housing, for example? And we talk about housing as a human right, and we want secure, safe, and comfortable homes as fundamental to our health and well-being. So it's acknowledging that housing is connected to many other aspects of the donut. We then defined a set of outcomes that we might want to look at. So we'll actually go into the more detail here. This is our little summary, but for each dimension, we developed some detail. We have principles for housing in a regenerative Melbourne. So if we could describe what housing looked like in a really regenerative sense, what would that be? That's where we see needs of diverse households being met at all stages of life and abilities, and reflective of our cultural diversity across our city. We would see housing oriented towards well-being, and we'd see it attuned to nature and resilient to our changing climate, which is a more nuanced way than we often hear housing described as, where it's a commodity and it's what we use to build our wealth, but how is it really serving our health and well-being and that of the planet? And so what we were able to do was define a series of outcomes around security, making sure that housing is affordable and safe, has secure tenure, design, making sure that our housing is designed for the future that we need, and amenity and connection. So how are our neighborhoods actually created and designed to make sure that we can meet our daily needs and see our neighborhoods as places for social connection? And so this was all what we tested and affirmed during our workshop series, and that allowed us to pursue data that we wanted to be able to record and track about the kinds of things that we think can help us to measure how we're doing in relation to each of those outcomes. And so here, for example, under housing security, we looked at really these extreme measures of homelessness and overcrowding, as well as then households that are both low income and facing rental or mortgage stress. And so we were able to identify the current stats in relation to these things, as well as then setting targets where we proposed what we thought could be possible by 2030. Now, when we were setting targets, it was a really interesting exercise because we wanted to set targets that were ambitious, but equally things that if we collectively put our minds to them, we could realistically achieve. We didn't want to be setting entirely unrealistic targets. So everything that we've identified here, we have reviewed with experts in each relevant sector in a way to test the feasibility of these targets, noting that all of them are dependent on incredible political will and alignment and systems shifts in how we understand, again, what our priorities are. So that's really how we started out exploring the social foundation of the donut. When we looked at the ecological ceiling, we took a slightly different approach because the nature of the data and the dimensions is quite different. The planetary boundaries that describe the ecological ceiling are scientifically derived. And so these came from an understanding of, from a global view, how do we understand what the capacity of our ecological systems is? And let's use an accounting methodology to downscale that to understand what our proportional impact can and should be, basically. We as Melburnians, what impact are we allowed to have on these global systems to still maintain our safety effectively within our ecological systems? And so we worked with a partner called Open Corridor, who's done really extensive data science-based modeling in this space and was able to help us construct what these boundaries look like for Greater Melbourne and basically how far we're exceeding many of them, not all of them, but many of them. And so this was a really interesting kind of balanced approach where we included this very collective method for developing the social foundation and then much more scientific and data-driven approach to the ecological ceiling, which was really helpful to be able to test what both methods could share with us. And perhaps the last thing I'll share before I stop sharing screen for a little bit about this is that we recognized from the beginning of this work that we couldn't tell everything we wanted to about our city just using data. And so we realized how important stories were to this equation. And so we developed out this stories section of the city portrait, which was really a way to start to bring together a more systemic view of how we understand the dimensions of the donut coming together. So I'll show one example, which again reflects some of the work we're doing to try to make the Birrung, the Yarra River, swimmable. So part of the goal of our stories was, again, to take that systemic view. So we started to say, okay, if we talk about something like swimming in the river, what elements of the donut start to come together? And we see that this relates to water, it relates to health, it relates to arts and culture. We could add a few dimensions to this, but that's really a starting point. And then on the ecological side, we're looking at, nitrogen and phosphorus loading because that impacts water quality as well as biodiversity loss and what we've seen around the impacts to the river system over time because of development and so on. And so we started to look through each of these stories at how we could move ourselves towards the donut through this kind of framing, as well as what we're already seeing happening across Greater Melbourne. So really acknowledging that, we've set some of these aspirations, but we've done so in collaboration with partners who are doing some really exciting work in this space. And so this was a space where we could profile and bring together examples of partners who are dedicating significant effort towards aligned aspirations. And what's exciting is that we could start to develop really endless stories when we think about all of the various activities that we see happening across Melbourne, helping to move us towards that regenerative future. And so we're really keen to continue to build out these stories, to build that catalog and profile the amazing work that we see happening all over the city on multiple fronts. So I will stop sharing for a little bit there.
Thank you for the overview. I have a question about the donut. When you've been, I guess it might be a bit harder for you since you've been so involved in this process, but I guess maybe that's the first question is there anything that surprises you about our donut when you see it and maybe we're doing better in some aspects or we're doing worse in some aspects than you would have thought? And then I guess the second part to that question is, when you show the donut to people, is there a common part of the donut that they focus on or that draws their attention?
I think Some aspects did not surprise me at all. So if I look at the social foundation, we're doing the least well, let's say, on mobility. And that's largely a function of how the city has grown and what that requires of people to move around, moving long distances, primarily relying on car-based travel. And so when we look at mobility systems that can be equitable, affordable, sustainable, and so on, our decision-making is not entirely lining up with those kinds of outcomes. So some things like that did not surprise me a lot at all. Some aspects, I think, did surprise me a little bit. And perhaps this is coming back to how we frame what it means to be meeting our social needs in a place like Melbourne. So, for example, when we look at water, we talk about Melbourne being a very dry city often on the whole. I mean, it's been raining this week, but on the whole, it's a fairly dry place. And so to some extent, and we may, be thinking about water security over the longer term, but when we looked at both water from a social side, which is really about, do we have secure access to safe drinking water and sanitation? The answer was largely yes. We were pretty much within bounds there in the ways that we chose to measure that. And likewise, on the outside of the donut, yes, also our water consumption in terms of freshwater withdrawals was actually doing okay. But I think what's interesting about this is that this is a point in time. And what it doesn't show us, which we're really interested in exploring in different ways, is how do we capture the narrative over time? What has this looked like previously? Are we getting better? Are we getting worse? What are the kinds of mitigation efforts that we need to be moving towards to make sure that where we are doing well, we can retain that? So I think, there's a little bit of, I think for us, it's opened up a lot of questions around, the donut tells us a lot, but what more do we need to learn based on what it's started to reveal?
Yeah. That makes sense. Because, the mobility part for me was, I intuitively knew it by living in Melbourne, but just to see it so out of scope was quite alarming to me. I guess, in your mind, if we look at the donut, I guess, as a whole, and it can be either socially or environmentally, do you see any, common themes across some of them that tie them together, whether that be government policies or the state of the economy right now? I guess, are there some sort of larger themes that you've been able to draw out when looking at the donut as a whole for Melbourne?
Yes, I think one of the things that comes together for me is about how spatial planning relates to the donut. The donut is not in and of itself a spatial framework because we're sort of abstracting these systems out to a metropolitan scale. Certainly, at this scale, although the donut can be scaled down to any place. So you could make a donut for a street or a neighborhood or an LGA. We've chosen to set our boundaries as Greater Melbourne, roughly. But I think what's interesting is thinking about how the dimensions that we have on the donut relate to spatial planning. And pretty much all of them do in different ways. And so when we think about decision making and what's happening within government, for example, we know there's a massive emphasis on housing. And yet when we hear discussions about housing, often it's just about housing and where are we going to put that housing and where do we have space to do that? And what we would suggest is that when we start to look at place holistically, or even with housing as an entry point, we also need to be looking at mobility, and we also need to be looking at what that means for access to work, which we know is reflected in some ways through policies that are being presented and so on. But we think there's opportunity for greater nuance in the way that that's understood. I think what's also interesting is some of the dimensions that might not seem as obviously spatially driven, but things like political voice, where we're talking about how we strengthen the decision-making that all of us can have and the role we can all play in decision-making in matters that affect our lives. That is a spatial question because how physically connected we feel to other people and to our community leaders and to our government officials actually impacts how we might mentally feel connected or disconnected. And so the way we form our city has an impact in how connected we feel in all of these different ways. And so the more that we can start to use the donut and other tools to demonstrate those connections between, I think, spatial planning and these conceptual elements, the more powerful I think the tool can be. And that's one of the things that we've been exploring is how do we take it to that next level and draw those linkages more clearly. And I'm, distilling again the complexity of some of these arguments around housing and what does go into the work. And I realize that there is a substantial amount that gets built into the way that policies are developed. And yet I still think that there is a more sophisticated way that those can be presented and understood holistically.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense when you talk about it like that. Because, it's not just about looking at one aspect of the donut, but it's about how are you considering all the other things, whether it be environmentally or socially. And I think the thing that the donut really brought to my mind when I first looked at it was I've been studying sustainability at uni, doing a postgraduate in it, and everything that I had been doing up until that point was solely on the environment. So things like climate change or climate change policy, and the social side of things never really came into my mind. And then when I read the donut, it really brought it out in saying, okay, all of these things are completely interconnected. You cannot look at one thing without looking at the other. And I think that's the power of the donut. And what you are creating is, okay, we're talking about housing. We need to build houses. Okay, what are the other things that we have to consider? How is this going to affect, like you're saying, mobility? Is it going to make it worse? Is it going to make it better? Yeah, where are we choosing to build it? And all those other questions, I think, is the power of what's being created here and is what, was brought to my mind when I first was introduced to all of this.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And I think, again, part of the power of the donut as a framework is a way, as you said, it describes that interconnectedness. And I talk about it sometimes as trade-offs, at least being aware of the trade-offs that we're making when we choose different pathways. Going back to the housing example, we sometimes talk about, the way that we build our housing on greenfield land because it might be cheaper to do so up front has longer term impacts on our food security because that's often where we are currently growing food. And likewise, if we think about our overall carbon budget that we might have available to stay within our international commitments, let alone our commitments to the planet itself, the way that we approach building new housing has significant impacts on that as well. But even at a smaller scale, at a micro scale, you might imagine thinking about the trade-offs. And this is an example that has some personal roots where I live, is this question of safety in a public park, for example, and the idea of introducing a lot of lighting at night to support safety, which in many ways is a great approach because you want all people to be able to use the space all the time. There's a social justice and equity element to that and a public safety element. And yet also having lights blasting all night in a public park can have detrimental effects to biodiversity. So how do you think about balancing these diverse needs and requirements and so on? Is there a lighting solution that's like the right tone of lighting so that it can still provide the safety benefit but not have the detrimental effect on wildlife? I'm not sure, but at least bringing those factors into play in decision making is something that I think hasn't happened in a nuanced way at all times in the past, to say that. And so in some ways, it's really just asking for really great integrated planning at various scales.
Yeah, first step is just being cognizant of it and then taking that to the planning stage, which is, exactly what's needed. I think, to touch on, I guess, since we're talking about policies a little bit, how has the donut been received so far by, I guess, decision makers or the government? How has that been received so far?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting experience since we launched the donut. So we had a number of policymakers at, I'd say, largely local and state levels involved in developing the donut, in part probably coming along out of curiosity, but also seeing alignment with respective goals. I think, I, having worked in government, am always amazed by the commitment of government officials to social and ecological outcomes, very much aligned with the donut. And I think where these start to come into tension again is coming back to that economic question around how we view the economy and its role. And I would say at the heart of a considerable amount of government decision-making is still a primary goal of economic productivity. And so when we center that, it sometimes makes it challenging to, again, look at these more holistic ways of approaching things. And so I'd say we have, in principle, a lot of support around an interest, at least, around the donut. And certainly we've had a number of conversations with local and state government about the donut since its release. But I think we're still in this exploration phase. I think one thing that we identified is that even just posing this question and putting out this provocation around shifting that goal is a pretty substantial change, and we acknowledge that. And so we're sort of saying, okay, let's take baby steps in many ways to say, what does this look like in practice, and how can we test this, and how can we apply this in our own work to show what it means before we expect that it's going to be taken on in a mainstream sense, because we know, again, it's a significant shift in the underlying values that inform a lot of decision making. And so we're really interested in how the donut can be used both for the sort of data that sit behind it in a really technical sense, but also the provocation and the discussion starter that it can serve as, and how it can guide conversations around how we make decisions and what we prioritize, and what more do we need to know to actually make those decisions, and who's involved, and all of those kinds of things. So I think it has a lot of potential in that policy space as a process as much as a sort of technical tool, if that makes sense.
Yep. And are there any, I guess, learnings, or are you in contact with the other cities or governments that have implemented the donut? For example, I think Amsterdam has a donut that they use. I guess, have they been a resource for you guys in building this, and in what's coming up next as well?
They have been. So we have a really great working relationship with the Doughnut Economics Action Lab, which is Kate Rayworth's team, and they play a fantastic role in convening cities globally who are playing with the donut or working with the donut in different ways. And so through our relationship with the DEAL team, as well as with other cities directly, we've had a chance to understand how different cities have approached this idea of creating a city portrait, and how different cities are now using that in practice. So Amsterdam was the first city to create a city portrait, and in fact, it was their methodology that largely kicked off this work in a lot of other places. I think they form a really great example where, to some of what I was saying earlier, the donut wasn't the end goal, but what it did was give them a baseline view of where the city was doing well and where the city needed to change some of its practices. And the donut really, the city portrait really underpinned their circular economy strategy that they developed out of that. And so that was actually the piece of work that then guided a lot of policies and programs and so on. But it was based on that foundation that the city portrait process had given them. And so that's been really interesting to learn from. We certainly looked at a lot of other cities in the way that they visualized the donut and how they put data to it and did some of the measurement. And now we're looking at how other cities are applying it in practice. And so we see places like Cornwall starting to create decision-making tools out of the donut, so they can actually take a project or a policy and say, yes, this would have positive impacts on these dimensions and negative impacts on these dimensions. So let's rethink how we structure that and re-examine what's possible. So we're looking at how you can start to get more tactical in applying the donut in practice, and the way that we see some other cities doing that. And it's exciting because it's also just helpful to learn and know that this is a challenging process, and we're all kind of learning as we go in doing it.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it must be such a process to get that in front of the decision makers, and as the steps you've outlined. So it's good to know that I guess everyone's collaborating and across different countries and cities, and the DEAL Lab doing amazing work. I wanted to jump back into the donut quickly. I had a personal question. I was interested about the land conversion because I noticed that was massively overshooting when we look at the donut. I guess, are there any reasons or root causes behind that?
Yes, that is one that stands out considerably and doesn't surprise me, because the way that we've mapped the ecological ceiling is to reflect consumption in Greater Melbourne. So it's reflective of all of the things that we are consuming that may be produced here or may be produced elsewhere. So if you look at the land conversion numbers, they aren't just reflective of the physical footprint of Melbourne, but they're also reflective of the footprint that's required for all of the food that we consume, for example, and some of the other goods that we consume here in Melbourne. Mm-hmm. So it's actually thinking about land in Melbourne and beyond Melbourne required to support our lifestyles. And so that's why it's really big, because we are a high consumption city relative to some other places in the world. And so I think that's one of the really interesting ways in which the donut can help us to start to open up the view of, again, the impact of our day-to-day on not just our city, but places beyond our city. So that's why that is very large, is because we consume a lot, and that includes things like looking at livestock production required to support a diet that includes more meat and so on. So there are a lot of different factors that are folded into that modeling. One thing that we'd love to be able to produce is a view that also includes our production. So what are we producing in Melbourne and then exporting elsewhere, and what's the impact of that? But that's not yet been folded into the analysis.
Okay, yep, interesting. I guess just following that path as well, what is next for the donut?
Yes. So we are constantly reviewing what our plans are for the donut. I think it's been a really useful, reflective period that we've had since we released it last year. And we have a couple really specific plans for extending the content of the donut. So the city portrait methodology in the truest sense, like what Amsterdam explored and what other cities have looked at, includes 4 lenses. And so our donut includes 2 lenses. The inside is focused on our social outcomes at a local level, and the outside of the donut is currently focused on our ecological outcomes at a global scale. So if you think of this as a matrix, we've got our global and local, and we've got our social and ecological. So we need to fill in those other 2 corners to say, what's the global social view first? So what is our impact, kind of going back to that consumption-based question? What is our impact on social outcomes globally? And that might include things like positive things like how we can export education globally because we're a powerhouse for that. But also negative social outcomes like our cheap products are at the expense of livable wages elsewhere in the world. So how do we balance? How do we understand and balance those? We're also then, the 4th dimension is that, or that 4th lens is the local ecological. So again, we've looked at our impact on global ecological well-being, but what's the health of our ecosystems? What is our air quality like here generally? What's the health of our soil? What's the health of our waterways? So how do we start to paint that bottom-up picture? So we want to be developing that content this year, and that's what we'll be kicking off in a few weeks, which we're quite excited about. We are also quite excited that some of that work we're aiming to do with partners who are really deeply embedding an Indigenous view on the, particularly the ecological side, but certainly thinking about how that sits across this whole framework. So that's something that we're really dedicated to bringing into this cycle of content development as well. And the other side of the work is really about what does this look like in practice? How do we spread the word, have conversations like today's, which is super exciting? How do we get into policy discussions more fully, really understanding the nitty-gritty of some of that decision-making and how we can be using the donut for those purposes? How can we be getting into education and think about this as a tool that might be really useful in schools for students who are trying to explore these topics? And how do we work, with partners who might be looking at the donut as a framework that they'd like to deploy themselves? And it might be, in its fullest sense, or just the thinking that sits behind the framework as a whole. So we're in this phase where it's pretty exciting that we can, again, continue to build on the content, but also look at how we put it into practice and continue to play with it. We want there to be fun and kind of joy in all of the ways that we work with this, because it's a donut and there's something just kind of playful inherent in that too. So we want that to be continued in the way that we talk about the roles that this can play in our city.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah, I mean, I was having a conversation about this to one of my friends the other day, and I've talked about Doughnut Economics to him numerous times, and he just asked me the question. He said, why have I not seen more of this? I said, it's early, give it some time. We'll get there. But yeah, it makes me happy to hear that, we're thinking about how do we get it out there? How do we get people involved in this? I mean, I could be living in a bubble, but all my friends and people that I talk to are genuinely interested in this when I speak to them. And there is really a need to just see how our city's going. People always ask the question, how are we actually going? How is Melbourne going past the news, past the narratives, and to really have a tool to just be able to dive in and look at that. I guess just a question that's popped in my head. How have you found the usage of the tool on the website so far?
Sure. So we had a big burst of activity, of course, right after the launch, and that's leveled out a bit, but we do see people coming back to it and still stumbling on it through different channels. So to your point, where there was sort of the circle of people who, we had a lot of people involved in the process. So it was a hugely collaborative process, which was part of what made it so exciting and fun for us. And then, that big sort of circle of people who are familiar with the Doughnut and have been involved in Regen's work in different ways. But I think now it's starting to get that slower trickle out. But I think where it's picking up is because it's resonating more deeply, and there's greater opportunity to then start playing with it in more detail. So I think it's interesting. It's, there's the breadth and the reach, but what's the purpose of that? And so now that we can start to say, okay, maybe that initial big burst of response has slowed a little bit, but where we're starting to have our conversations, it's more about the detail of how do we put this into practice, which is equally exciting for us.
Beautiful.
So that's been really fun.
Yeah, it's great. I think it might just be worthwhile just running through the other things that Regen Melbourne has going on. I know you've mentioned make the Yarra swimmable again, which I am personally very excited about. I would absolutely love that. But yeah, maybe if you could take us through the other things that Regen Melbourne has going on.
Yes, absolutely. So the swimmable Birrarung is our most progressed project, but we have two other projects that are in earlier stages that are also very exciting and arguably more distributed across the city. So when we start to think about this reach, more opportunity to be getting out in different parts of the community. One is called Regen Streets. So it's kind of taking all of the aspects of the Doughnut. And when we talk about holistic regeneration, it's really trying to ground those at a street level to say, what does this look like in a very specific place? And the idea is both to benefit specific streets where we will be experimenting with what this looks like, but then also to take that learning to be able to create a wave of regenerative streets. And the idea is that that wave is what's really going to be able to impact the way we understand policy and decision making at a larger scale. So we're really thinking about the tactical on the ground work that's really important and the broader strategic systems change that can come from that. And then their newest project is looking at regenerative food systems. And we know that there's a lot of activity happening in the food space. So we're in the early exploration phases right now of understanding what's the best role that we can play as a convener, bringing together lots of different partners to move everyone again towards an ambitious goal, towards a regenerative food system. So keep your eye out for what will emerge there. It'll be probably the next few months that we'll be doing this early sense-making work, and then we'll start to form specific actions and sort of sub-projects within that after that time. So those are the leading projects right now. And my work is most focused on not only the city portrait, but also how this sits within the broader systems lab. And the systems lab is really our space for exploration of the big messy questions around how do we make sure that we have the context set up and the enabling functions set up to support all of our work. So how do we look at the role of research and policy and storytelling and capital as these enablers that allow our projects to be successful, but also the broader kind of shifts to the system that we want to see, how we make sure that those can be possible as well. So that's in early stages as well in terms of forming a lot of the activities that we'll be pursuing there. But those are, again, things around the measurement work, as well as things around participation and governance and some other elements that we can be exploring in a more kind of open-ended way.
It's exciting.
Yes,
Absolutely.
it is.
Exciting stuff going on. Excited about the food. Yes, sustainable food. That'd be,
That's
that would
right.
be
And I think
very
that's,
good.
and that's one where on the Doughnut, food is one dimension, but we know it impacts and is impacted by pretty much everything else. And we love to gather around food. Certainly that's a highlight for our team. So the more food, the better, I think, in terms of how we talk about and define our work.
Definitely. Do you have a update on making the Yarra swimmable, as in, yeah, sort of where are we at? What's the goals, timelines? Yeah, how's that looking so far?
Sure. So we are at the point in that work where we're starting to move towards what we're calling leverage points, which are like the initial actions and projects on the ground that will help to move us towards that big goal. So it's not starting with the whole river opening up for swimming, but it's starting with some things that can be helping us to make that possible. So one thing we have coming up later this year will be Riverfest, which is an opportunity for Regen Melbourne in collaboration with the Yarra River Keepers Association and other partners to be developing this festival, basically, to get people out to the river and celebrate the river and raise awareness about the river, because we know a lot of what we want to be doing through this work is actually to help reorient our understanding of the river, our relationship to it, the role it plays in the city, all of those things. And so just getting people to the river is part of that before we can get everybody in the river everywhere that we want to. So that's one thing we have coming up. And there's another initiative we've been looking at around how we can visualize water quality data. So again, going back to that question of data and storytelling, how do we gather the data we need to be able to make decisions about swimmability and whether it's safe to swim in the river? But also, how do we communicate that in really interesting and compelling ways that helps to raise public awareness? So we're looking at ways that we can have kind of more artistic and creative displays around water quality data that can help to tell that story. So those are a couple examples of things that are emerging as opportunities on the river. But there are a bunch of other things that are in earlier stages and underway. And so it's really just trying to line up the right partners around each of those initiatives and also support a lot of the energy that other partners are running with as well.
Mm-hmm. I love the idea of Riverfest. I think it comes back to the healing and connecting to country, right? Like
absolutely
connecting to this river that has been such a massive part of, the culture and the stories and the history of Greater Melbourne. So yeah, I really love that. Just connecting with it for us, see how that feels. And yeah, I think it's a beautiful way to go about it. So
that's right.
Excited for that. Yeah. So for the average Melbourneite who wants to get involved, wants to, I guess, understand the city or wants to participate, volunteer or contribute in any way, how do you see them playing a role in what Regen Melbourne is looking to do?
Yes, lots of different ways. We still convene, we still come back to those roots in community kind of activations that were the origin story behind the Melbourne Doughnut and the reason why we exist. And so we run seasonal assemblies, which is largely a way for that broader community or anyone who's interested to come along and learn more about what we're doing and feed into the projects. But we'll also be kicking off a series of events later this year, which we hope will be an ongoing thing that really helps anyone who's interested in coming along to dive more deeply into the work around what are we learning, what are we seeing, who are we working with, really starting to take some of the really compelling questions that we're digging into and open those up. So we're really excited to be launching that once it gets going in a couple of months, probably. So keep an eye out for any of those opportunities. We have a newsletter that goes out roughly on a monthly basis. And so that includes news about our own work as well as the broader kind of state of regenerative activities in Melbourne and beyond. So it's a really great resource for lots of different things happening beyond our own work as well. So would suggest checking that out. And then likewise, within our projects, we often have opportunities for broader community members to be involved. And we rely on those too. When I go back to the city portrait workshops, we were really reliant on the input and expertise of a variety of people coming in from different vantage points. And so again, we'll be picking up some of those workshopping sessions as we build out the new content on the city portrait. So would love to have people come along who haven't necessarily been involved in our work before, because fresh perspectives are really useful for opening up our thinking. We get so deep in it. It's really great to have new voices come along, new questions emerge. And so again, those are the kinds of things we tend to advertise through our newsletter or LinkedIn or things like that. And likewise, I suppose, as our projects are progressing, as Regen Streets progresses, as some of our work on participation progresses, there's going to be more that we'll be doing out within communities across the city. And so we'll be really seeking a lot of activity and participation in that work as well. So I think we're at a bit of a tipping point where our chance to be out and more visible in different parts of the Greater Melbourne community is really going to start to increase, which is really exciting as well.
Exciting stuff at Regen Melbourne. I'm really enjoying seeing the journey of the organization and all the work that you've been doing. Yeah, it's just beautiful, incredible stuff. And I will do my part in trying to share the word of all the work that you're doing. But thank you for all of your time today. It's been a real privilege and just really informative. I've loved looking at the Doughnut, and so I feel like I've had my own one-on-one seminar on it, which is great. But it's been a great conversation, and thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun.